Carnival Row season 2, Sharon.
Yeah, Carnival Row season two takes off more or less straight away from where season one ended. Just to sort of give you a bit recap, Carnival Row is set in a world um, sort of pre and sort of mid-industrial age. So if you was to talk to us, it'd be like the mid 19th century type thing. They've got steam trains, they've got guns, and they've been engaged in this war. But unlike sort of our world, creatures of mythology actually exist. So you have got fairies, you've got fauns and satyrs, and you've got any number of mythological creatures, but they live in the real world. And there's one of the lands in which the fairies have inhabited has been the source of a battle between these two sort of Western, we use our terms like two Western powers have been fighting over this land where the fairies live. And it has been sort of conquered. So the fairies and other fae folk have been sort of dispersed and they've ended up in this one particular land where they have been used as cheap labor. They're immigrants, so they live in like ghettos. They're used as cheap labor. They're used as the serving classes. They're not represented in parliament, and there's a growing sort of sense of dissatisfaction. And in the first season, all this sort of came to a head when basically all the fae folk, or Critch as they're nicknamed, are put into this ghetto, a walled ghetto. And this second season starts with basically they're in this ghetto and then they're trying to sort of work out where to go from there. The political parties are trying to, some of them are like pro, sort of like giving the fae a bit more sort of representation or advancing their rights, and others like, no, they're a menace, they're just a pest, we need to get rid of these immigrants to our land, they just like take our resources there. There's lots of parallels to what
Yeah.
immigration and sort of
Yeah,
racism and other isms, but there's lots of parallels, but they're sort of using this
yeah.
sort of
I,
construct for it.
I remember thinking that about the first season of Carnival Row. I didn't see much of it, but I did think that it was a very, very unsubtle parallel to the world today.
Yeah.
So everyone who's different is one of the fae, basically, and there is it's a little bit of a blunt tool in that it's like fae good, everyone else bad, and it's like, well, actually that's a bit too simplistic, isn't it? Really. So I mean, I think this season is trying to be a bit more nuanced. One of the countries called the Pack has had like a red revolution where led by this faun and they have basically created like communism in their town, and then this sort of revolution is spreading to the other parts of the crypt. But like the first season, the main characters are played by Orlando Bloom and Cara Delevingne, and he's a half fae, he's half fairy, half human, and she is fae, and they met during the war, and she thought he had died in the war, and then they met up again in in this land, and they restarted their relationship. But now their relationship, they're beginning to sort of see the strains of it, having how they're as much as they love each other, they're sort of drawn apart. She's got involved in this group called the Black Raven, which is like this sort of radical group that thinks that need to do to fight, use violence, use sort of direct means of sort of protest to sort of to try to fight the cause of the Fae. And he's more about, he wants to work within the system that's there, working within the police and then possibly politics. And so you see this sort of this conflict sort of expands. It becomes a bit more or less about the interpersonal relationships this time, and more about the politics of the various different states. So you see, yeah, the politics, how someone on the surface of it looks like they're pro say, and which, but they're really working for their own ends, and others where you think, um, yeah, they're looking at the economic value of the people who live there and the conflicts with other nations, how actually war can be quite good business because it means you produce weapons and other things, and others are looking at um, all these different parties sort of see it from their own point of view. So you have this sort of quite, this series is much more political. It's much more about you've got these big issues, and then when you break it down, there are loads of shades of grey rather than everything being sort of neatly divided into good versus evil. In each of these areas, there's more subtlety. So it's more subtle, but a bit more complicated, and they're much more political than the first season.
So it does more of a Game of Thrones than let's say the first season did. Like you know how there's shades of grey as opposed to black and white.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and the first season I think was more about the sort of not the romance of it, but it was more romantic in that it was about these two people sort of finding themselves again. And there was another couple who was he was a fawn and she was like a privileged sort of white lady with who like so it's like this sort of mixed race as it were, or
Yeah,
mixed
yeah, yeah,
species in this case sort of relationship.
yeah.
And this time you see the sort of how that's a bit more strained in this season because other influences come to bear and there was there was an underlying sort of murder mystery sort of thing running through it. And in this case, there's another like some horrible murders are happening, and they're trying to work out what the cause of them is. So you've got this sort of dual sort of timelines and stories. But no, it was good. It was more complicated, more more political, but slightly less sort of romantic. There was the odd, sort of amorous encounter, but
Yeah.
it was more. It was less of a as a yeah, sort of the romance wasn't that wasn't the most dominant storyline in it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
So yeah,
oh,
it's
oh.
interesting. It's worth a watch if you like your fantasy and sort of like world building fantasy. It's certainly worth exploring because it does look at all the different elements within how you build a world. It's like the politics, the religion, the sort of the social economics, uh, the work, yeah, it's sort of the different cultures versus and classes. It sort of throws all that in the mix. So it's really interesting from like a world building perspective. If you're
Mm.
interested in that sort of thing,
So
Yeah.
is it like a ghetto where all the Fae are?
yes,
It's like a
they've
ghetto.
been moved. They've been confined into this sort of ghetto after the last season where this a big thing happened, and so all
Okay.
of the Fae have been told, right, you have to live here, and you can
So
only come out if you have like a past. If you don't have a past, you're stuck in the ghetto
Bit
for
like the
okay.
Warsaw ghetto then.
like the
There's
Warsaw
it.
Ghetto.
Yeah,
It's
there's a
I think also I'm not sure if they carried this in from the first season, but I remember thinking that Carnival Row kind of looked like where Oliver Twist might live.
Yes, it's that sort of mid-Victorian sort of look about it,
Yeah,
where the women wear sort of the long dresses and the men wear, if they're wealthy, it's like the sharp suits and the hats and the long sort of dress coats and overcoats and the
yeah.
canes, and whereas waistcoats and sort of the fob watches, that sort of look. And the wealthy women have got like that. It's sort of like the end of the Victorian era because the women are like corseted but with like bustles, that sort of look rather than the crinoline. So you're looking at the firmly sort of 1880s, 1890s sort of fashion
Okay.
where they've sort of drawn on. But it was it's interesting sort of things they've drawn on to inspire it, and then it sort of draws in like the whole Russian Revolution thing is drawn into it with this the Pact Red Revolution.
Mm.
Yes, there's interesting
Or-
parallels to history in there.
So obviously you didn't like the first season enough to come back for the
Yeah,
second season, and the main question I have is we've already been told that this is the final season. Is it satisfying?
it does that whole bit at the end where you see each of the main characters where they are, but it does leave quite a bit left open. It does leave it the door open for you to speculate as about what could happen next. So yeah, I thought it was interesting. It wasn't a complete ending, as in that it sort of tied up everything neatly. It left a few things open to you to sort of think, I wonder where he's going to end up. But no, it was certainly worth an interesting. Yeah, it was worth a watch, and it was an interesting conclusion rather than a entirely satisfying conclusion.
All right, cool. So how many stars would you give Carnival Row season two?
I think I didn't like it as much as the first one. I didn't think because again you have to pay you have to pay a bit more attention to it, and there's some elements where I was thinking you're labouring the point a little bit here. The parallels between like the communist revolution and other things. I thought, yeah, this is becoming a little bit too obvious. So for
But
me,
that's the show's tone. That's the show's reason done. That's the
yeah,
reason for existing is to labor the point.
yeah. So it was a little bit, perhaps a bit more heavy-handed. Though there was a couple of unexpected deaths, which I think was quite interesting. It had the whole Game of Thrones thing where some of the quite have been principal characters, which is probably why you know it's the last season, is because they got some of them. You're thinking they were like there's a threat of death, and you're thinking, oh, something's going to happen. They're going to get away at the last minute, and actually they don't. They get a couple of characters
Oh,
do
that's
die,
good. I like that.
and you're like, wow, I didn't actually think you're going to kill them off.
Yeah.
So that was
yeah.
interesting that they actually did that. But they probably at that point they knew they weren't going to have a third season.
They're
So
like,
that's probably why they did it.
Doesn't
But no,
matter.
it was interesting. I'd give it 3 stars because I liked it, but I didn't love it. And I think give it a couple of years, and I'll probably thinking, Carnival Row. Oh yeah, I remember that. But it's not going to be one that's going to sit with me for a long time, I don't think.
All right, so 3 stars. 3 stars for Carnival Row season 2. And